I'm here with Josh Henslee, and we're here to talk about the potential of BSV for creators and artists. And there's been a lot of talk in BSV about creators, kind of content creators, like taking back their ownership of data and monetizing content on a micropayment scale and all that sort of thing. And I think all of that is really important because we definitely have seen a shift in how artists work as, independent entrepreneurs themselves. We're kind of closer to almost like an older patronage model where a creator's audience can be support them directly. And I think that's why we've seen the rise of things like Patreon and YouTube subscription and all this sort of stuff. So we're really interested in that. We really see the potential of BSV. I personally plan on building just about everything I do on BSV for, the next however long it may be. And so I really wanted to talk to you about what, in this early stage, where arguably art is like the least necessary thing on BSV, right? What can we do to utilize it in novel ways and potentially get novel results? And would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. So, well, first, thanks for having me. I think the thing to keep in mind is, the root of it is probably being humble, because what I've seen so far is, even though most folks are in crypto generally to just make, crazy profits or returns, there is opportunity to make more money than you could in the standard industry. So for example, I know Spotify, I don't know the details, but their pay per listen or whatever is very tiny. Yeah. And even mainstream artists like Taylor Swift have complained about it, how bad it is. There's no way anyone who's not known could make anything close to someone like Taylor Swift, which means that they must make next to nothing. However, with blockchain and crypto technology, really with BSV only, because I don't think you can really price NFTs below $1 on other chains. Maybe Solana is the exception, but you definitely can't do it for like less than, there's a floor there on the price. But the point is, if you just do one sale of an NFT, say for 50 cents, that's probably more than you would ever make on a standard platform like Spotify. And yes, 50 cents isn't going to pay any bills, but I think there is a kind of intangible thing there, benefit there of earning for your work. And that's what I've seen already take place, even on a pariah chain like BSV, where you've had artists come over because of the scale and because of the cheap mint price, they're able to mint these things and sell them and get a connection with their fans and establish that. And even if the fans, even if we're talking 5, 10, 50, 15, 50, 100 people, that I would argue that connection is better. And I'm curious to see the feedback of the actual artists who have done this. But, some of them might get 5, 10 sales, but they price it at $5 and they just made $50. $50, in the grand scheme of things is not a lot, but that could pay a bill for a month. That could, small stuff at the grocery store, right? So there's a difference already being made.
Yeah, in my experience putting out content on BSV has been it has felt really good. Like I did an interview with Daniel Krawitz like about a year and a half ago, and I put it on Streamanity, and I made like $35 or something off of it. which, you know, realistically, to put a video on YouTube and get $35, I mean, that's, you know, it's a lot. Not only do you have to go through a lot of hoops to even monetize, but to get $35, you know, and instead I was able to capitalize on, I think, something like 20 people watching it or something, you know, which is a whole different paradigm for creators. I totally agree about the humility thing. I mean, you gotta build it step by step, you know, build a product and all that sort of thing. I guess one thing that I'm really curious about is, like, we've seen NFTs, you know, boom, and now they're less popular, I think. What do you think could be added to NFTs to make them kind of more interesting? Because right now they're all the same. I mean, we put out audio NFTs, which I would argue are a little more useful than JPEGs, but really not at the moment that much more useful, or provide that much more value to the audience. So what do you think is the future in terms of, like, extra functionality with that, and like what can be done with it?
Yeah, I think one obvious one that people have looked at that I think the success path is dubious are paywalling. So for example, you can only listen if you have this. That's probably not the correct direction to go unless it's early access. So I know Patreon has this feature where content creators can have, well, obviously private posts, but they can also have private podcasts. And I believe a use case of creators is, you know, oh, I will put the podcast out 5 days early and only the subs can get it. That would be one thing to do, because that would achieve the goal of potentially increasing revenue while not reducing your potential fan base and reach. So that's one way. I really think at scale, the benefits are the establishing and strengthening connections between the fans and the creator. If the creator knows who bought these, then that's value add, because a lot of these platforms, Patreon does this, but say YouTube doesn't. Users have to configure in their profile this, like if they're publicly subscribed to you or not. For example, on YouTube, I don't know my subscribers. If they comment, I can see if they publicly configured it that, okay, they have been subbed to me for X months. I can see that. But that's it. That's not really great data, because there's so many hoops even for me to see that, right? And honestly, I think that's ridiculous. I should be able to know who is, if, of course, they want to do it. But like I said, there's no list that I can go to. I have to wait for them to actually comment, right?
Right.
But for a creator, knowing who has bought my various NFTs, especially when you start thinking over time, that can not only will that strengthen connection and also enable the creator to do future airdrops, future benefits to those people who have bought it. It'll kind of create this FOMO effect, which is the desire in the first place to buy them, right? Because if people say, oh, you get backstage passes, you get monthly Zoom calls, whatever, they'll be like, oh, I got to buy this.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's what also me and you talk privately about why the prices need to be low, because that will encourage people to buy it. Even they won't really question if the price is so low, number one. But number two, it's the scale, right? And the churn.
Yeah.
You know, I see Patreon, for example, I think the lowest tier is $3, which, you know, frankly, is too high.
I've seen $1 Patreons
yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
Which, you know, people will question that less, but the subscription model will give them pause. But if it's like a one-time 10-cent thing, someone would and you press a button, you know, most people would do that.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of triggers like a side thought for me, which is that because you know, in a world where everybody is using NFTs for their intended purpose and sort of competing to sell them, it is really interesting. Like, what that could produce, because, you know, already you have, it's almost, I guess it's almost like the reverse of what you have today, because as it is on YouTube or platforms like YouTube, because of the algorithm and all that, you're kind of, all content is kind of drifting. It's being like drawn to the center. It's like drawn to homogeneity. Whereas with NFTs, it's almost like a race to dissipate, you know, and like scatter as far as possible, and like offer something different with each individual token, which is interesting. I mean, it's a bit of a wild, wild west thing. I wanted to ask, like, on a kind of a structural level. So when we were thinking about how to do what we wanted to do, which was that we already had released music, and their mixtapes of original music, and we were thinking how to make an NFT out of it. And we kind of ran through a couple of different possibilities. You know, simplest thing would be that the NFT is like access to the download link. But we didn't think that, you know, is really anything special. So I decided that the most novel thing we could do at the moment is to get the audio on chain, right? And unfortunately, due to the 10 megabyte limit on Relay, which we'll get into also, by the way, you know, we had to take the audio and reduce its quality significantly. So it's like, sounds like it's playing on a Super Nintendo or something. And it's like, so my question for you then is there really a benefit to having the audio on chain? Because to me, that's, I don't know where it's going, but it seems like maybe the right move for the future, but I'm not sure. So curious what you think.
Yeah, I think definitely, for sure. We already see some of the problems with censorship and arbitrary takedowns of content. You know, YouTube's policies are frankly ridiculous with some of the stuff, because it's this top-down thing where they limit, which, you know, on one hand is fine if, as long as they communicate that. But I've seen where, you know, some the so-called violations are arbitrary, where, you know, it's arbitrary or subjective based off who is reviewing the content. Whereas the chain, yes, in theory, nodes can do the same thing, but the immutability and the timestamping and the hash and the data integrity is a feature that you get whenever you actually pay the fee. It doesn't guarantee it's going to be there forever, but you can prove existence at a certain time, which I think is huge. Because, I mean, we see all the time where folks repost videos that's not theirs, and then they start earning from it. But obviously, when you publish something as the creator, if you know the transaction ID, that's unique to yourself, as well as wherever you sent the funds from. So you have proof of payment, right? So people know, okay, this was the origin. This is the person who did it. If I wanted to send money to them or buy future things from them, you have some on-chain link, whether it's an address, script, whatever, right? So people can validate, okay, this is from them, and any successive copies, you know, are fraudulent, because if they didn't come from the same person, right? So I think on that stand, it's great. And it also enables the creators to do it, because I think eventually UIs will be built to make it easy. Because, you know, I know a big problem is the middlemen with the music industry. You know, the publishers get in the middle, and they, you know, they force themselves with deals and agents and stuff. I'm not saying all that stuff is deprecated, but definitely you empower the creator more with this type of model.
Yeah, and I think that the idea of being able to upload a piece of digital media once and then monetize it across the entire, you know, internet essentially, right, is really appealing. But for me, I'm curious what you think. You know, I talked to Daniel a bit about this, and you know, we uploaded on Relay because I'm, you know, an amateur programmer at best, and you know, he was saying you don't need to use Relay, which I know is true, but at the same time, I don't not only do I not exactly know how to do it without Relay, but I'm wondering what, besides the obvious, the 10 megabyte limit benefit, like to what degree, I guess it also ties into how early this is, right? Because we're at a point in BSV where what the BSV economy needs is like tools and more like intellectual power being put into it and labor. And I'm wondering, like for the enterprising creator coming in, how much of this do they have to kind of take on their own in terms of like building all their own tools and using all their own stuff? And what are kind of the, I think, you and I both know the pitfalls of Relay, but like, what are the kind of the pros and cons of using a system like Relay? And also I'm curious if you can speak to the longevity of something like Relay and then the run token protocol, which I sort of only know a little bit about.
As far as using different platforms, I mean, there's always a risk there. Fortunately, with this stuff being on chain with a protocol that is not controlled and doesn't require any third-party validation, your risk level of like your content going down is fairly low. So on that regard, I don't think it's a problem. That 10 megabyte limit is actually enforced by the chain, by most miners at the moment. There is one miner that is making exceptions, but but applications don't really recognize it anyway. So it's basically enforced by the chain. So it's not really at the app layer, which is a problem, right? And I've talked about that before. It's just a scale thing. Like as demand increases, that limit will go away in time. But obviously that's not good enough for a lot of people who want to go now. And that ties in the part about the waiting or dealing with compromising on the quality and things like that. That rubs up against obviously artists wants the highest quality possible, right? And the compromise on that might be unacceptable. At the same time, waiting has consequences too, because if you're waiting, then you're not reaching potential fans, or there's an opportunity cost issue there. In my opinion, I think just doing it is the most important, because all that stuff can be taken care of later. These protocols and different things support updates. You can always update the file provably with the same, verification chain. So your authenticity is not a big deal. And yeah, like I said, Relay at the end of the day is really, at least for as far as uploading stuff, is just a skin on the Bitcoin protocol. So if Relay were to go down, all that stuff that's there stays there. Now, granted, someone else has to build it, but that's already actually happened. There's multiple markets that implement kind of the same techniques and scripts that Relay does. So I think long-term is not an issue. Kraywitz is right that you don't have to do it. You could write code yourself and do it. But in fact, if you do that, you do have to, there are some things you have to comply with Relay. Like you have to use some of their custom things to get it to show on their platform, which, there's some technical reasons for that. But I mean, there's just trade-offs, right? I mean, when you're dealing with these platforms, I mean, because technically you're entering into an agreement, right? Because they take 3% of every trade for NFTs. So, it's all kind of a balancing act. But I think the most important thing is just going full speed ahead. And then just, if you run into a brick wall, you just fall down, get right back up and go through it next time.
Yeah, totally. Do you see a future where everybody kind of operates their own store space, or do you see the idea of like these NFT marketplaces or something being more common than the idea of like the independent selling?
I think there'll be both. I think the number of direct will increase a lot. That has actually already been happening with the more popular NFT projects on BSV. They've made their own fronts which, you know, they have an advantage there of authenticity, right? They solve that problem because it's from their domain, right? Instead of sending people to a third party, because that's always a risk too, because you're making them sign up elsewhere.
Yeah.
But the another benefit is you don't the fees, right? You can get rid of those. And then you can also enforce royalties in more complex structures that maybe a third party doesn't, right? So like, for example, Relay supports royalties, but only to a single address, right? Maybe you want to pay 50 people, right?
Yeah.
And the protocol certainly supports that, so you could be able to pull that off, right? And you could do more interesting things too. But on the other hand, for discovery, people might funnel through one of these third parties. But I think the market for that will decrease because people will be doing more direct things. And because of the cheap fees and, you know, the openness of the chain, they'll be able to do that. They don't have to ask for third-party access to get this data and these orders. They can just go directly to the blockchain and get it and then show it on their site. So I think the incentives are there for domains and projects to sell direct, but for the discovery and actually pulling more folks in and for people to see. And, you know, there might be deals worked out where they push people to direct sites because they're doing the discovery. You know, they take a bigger risk. Maybe we got better servers, you know, more capital. So, and more of a marketing reach, right? So I think it'll be kind of a 50-50 type thing.
Yeah. And I feel like the best case scenario, which I'd like to hear if you think is more likely than not, is if it's all really interoperable, you know? Like I really think the idea of like a independent artist uploading, you know, a song one time and then giving Spotify the access, although hopefully Spotify won't exist in that future, but giving Spotify the access, giving, you know, when they have the music on TikTok or whatever, like giving that access here and just granting the access and the permission and complying with, oh, this company takes this royalty, this company takes this, and all that, but just having that interoperability aspect. I mean, do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think the interoperability, yes. Whether it'll play out like you described, I think is that's going to be rough, right? Just because of all the logistical and contract stuff that goes on. But yeah, I think it absolutely, at the base, it is interoperable in that way, especially when you have standard protocols, right? Like, you can imagine in a multi-chain universe, that's probably not feasible, right? Because the risk there increases with each new chain adopted. Whereas if there's one, it makes it very easy. You just, you know, query, get a raw transaction and, you know, figure out how to get the data out. And then that's it. You read it, you inspect it. I mean, these things already exist with in the enterprise world with, you know, how money is sent around with ACH credit cards or how orders are placed. It's called electronic data interchange, you know, when orders are placed between two vendors. So this stuff already exists, but crypto is nowhere close to that. I hope it does get there. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, logistical nightmare aside, I feel like that is the best future for creators because it, you know, offers the most control and you kind of are able to, yeah. I mean, it would be nice. Would be nice.
And then if that stuff is registered, like if you imagine more complex schemes where this stuff becomes legally recognized as, you know, ownership and property, I mean, then that can really move up against the current status quo of you know, where the middlemen have control. Because if the artist does it and then it's recognized, there's no debates, right? Now you're talking about people being liable if they try to pull off these weird scams or whatever, or, you know, try to say who if they try to dispute ownership, that's going to be costly. So that will stop because, oh no, it's his clearly, right? Like he proved it. He put it there at this time. It's indisputable. That data matches this hash. They registered it with the with whatever legal stuff you got to file. I mean, indisputable.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that what would happen is you'd have some kind of standardizing format, because like, you know, for example, like if you upload something on SoundCloud, that's Creative Commons license. And I feel like there has to be like a sort of like a development on the Creative Commons license to encompass that idea that like you upload it once, you do own it, and then now you can essentially grant the access to, you know, all the different services that you want to use. I think long time ago, I'm trying to remember who I heard say this, but it was a really interesting idea, which was kind of like what we were talking about with Relay, where like Relay can go down, but all the things are still there. Like if that is the case in the future, it's almost like you could imagine like Spotify rising up and then another one beating it out and using the same libraries, right? And so it's like the music collection, the library just gets bigger and bigger, and then different companies just have different, you know, market share or whatever at different times. I mean, do you see it playing out that way? And I guess if it did, it would almost kind of push you more to go to that direct to artist relationship, right? Because you'd get tired of using these big conglomerates when instead you could be like, you know, here are my 10 favorite artists. I'm going to go to their platforms instead.
Yeah, if like I talked about with the storage, once you know, miners don't really prune the data yet. I think they will, but if there are ways for artists to, again, have some other standard with the nodes where it says, when I publish this song, you guys aren't going to prune it. And whatever that looks like, whatever that contract looks like, maybe it's payment every year, whatever, to preserve it on the chain. If that exists, you can imagine that music won't ever be lost again. I mean, think about all the CDs and cassette tapes that were released over the last 50 years that never made it onto somewhere like YouTube or Spotify.
Oh, yeah.
In this future, that's gone, right?
Yeah.
Because YouTube, I mean, I know they're very strict with this licensing stuff. I mean, if people try to upload different songs from artists, I mean, if you go old and back enough, they probably won't do anything because whoever it is isn't even around, or is too old to care, or was too obscure, right? To do. And in fact, if they were that obscure, they probably want it to stay up because it's notoriety, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise, no one will listen to it. But in the new way, if it is truly immutable and it stays there and there's some type of guarantee, then yeah, I mean, you can have music libraries that persist, and then you get rid of proprietary ones. Because if someone wants to take the risk of putting that into an app and sharing it and monetizing it, then they got to risk the capital and the resources to do so. But you won't have this monolith like Spotify. I do know that, you know, obviously I'm not privy to the contractual and licensing stuff that comes with that. But again, that kind of goes away if artists start doing it. And, you know, this might be a fringe thing at first, right? With like we talked about at the very beginning, where people who couldn't do it otherwise can monetize with this new technology. And that might drive it up. It might be like grassroots driven up. And then some big artist sees it, it's like, oh, let me try this out too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's almost definitely going to play out that way, you know, because no big artist is going to, you know, take that risk until it becomes like, you know, the people's choice, I think. But also, like, you know, so I buy a lot of vinyl, and I buy a lot of new vinyl. Like in the world of like dance music, you know, there's still singles that are released, 300 copy runs, and these are not you know, they're not doing it for money. That's all I can say. I mean, the music is great, but like you're getting these vinyls, but then like you'll look on sites like Discogs, you know, which I love a lot, and it's just so interesting that like you'll look at, you know, records from the 70s, let's just say the whole decade, you know, 99.9% of those records from the 70s are all probably worth less than $1 now. and then there's a tiny amount that's worth like $100 plus, to get a really good copy. It could get even more expensive. And these are not, it's not the Donna Summer records. These are like the real rare, records that like became sleepers for a while, and then somebody rediscovered it and figured out, oh, this is rare. And then that pushed the price up. And I feel like one of the things that really initially attracted me to BSV and that has like stayed in my mind is the potential for music releases to like incrementally grow in value over time, like even if that's a couple of cents, even if it's tiny, it's like the idea of like your SoundCloud song kind of increasing in value year after year after year because it's getting so many plays and people love it. I think that's another, really amazing thing that BSV allows for. It's like the first time that's possible digitally, right? So yeah, I wanted to transition into talking about our specific release. So we put out 100 copies of this NFT tape, and we priced it at 0.1 BSV, and we sold one copy, which I consider a win. We all know 0.1 BSV could be worth a lot of money one day, but I'm curious, like, because so after we did all that, and we have like 3 more releases. Like tomorrow, we're gonna put out another 100 for release 2, so on and so forth. And a lot of BSV, because where we are in it, a lot of it is kind of like community building and like getting eyes on the project itself. And yeah, we talked about pricing it very low and kind of experimenting with, and then obviously like what the actual NFT does for the audience. So I'm curious, like, what your feelings are in terms of like building an audience, because it's like the world that I come from of music and that my friends, because I had to bring my friends into BSV, right? So the world we all come from is like, marketing on Instagram, making content, performing live. It's like the real world of music. But now there's BSV land, which is like its own, little world. So I'm curious what you think about how somebody creative can kind of market within that world and gain a foothold.
You asked about, how can you build the community by merging the previous world with the music stuff and the,
Yeah.
kind of the
Well,
grassroots with the BSV.
right. Well, and to add on to that, like I heard a podcast with Jack Liu and Daniel, and they were, there's this attitude in BSV, which I agree with, which is that like, you have to, if you're in the BSV economy, you should be focused on the people within the BSV economy. And you have to kind of, and in the world of music and what we do, which is like underground music, there is a whole side of, building and attracting an audience out in the world of social media and, the streets and all that. And then there's what I'm hoping, which is that we can establish a kind of a foothold in the world of BSV, which is totally different. I don't want to say totally different, but like, it is different. A different world where you have to kind of establish a bit of a community. And I'm curious your thoughts or advice on how to go about doing something like that.
Yeah. I do agree that marketing to folks within the BSV space, while small, is important, because one positive aspect of this community is that because of the negativity and it considered being the pride chain or whatever, people have huge incentives to pump anything positive and spread it. So whenever newcomers come in or anyone who takes a risk and does something creative, people have an inclination, even if they're not necessarily interested, to at least try it at first. And I've seen that happen for 3 years now, and it's been very consistent. So I think that is important. However, that doesn't do anything to bridge the gap with the legacy part, which arguably is the target audience. But like I said, even if you get some conversions from people who would never even look at it otherwise, I think that can help bridge the gap because the same will apply the other way, right?
Yeah.
The other folks, when they get shielded, especially if it's low barrier to entry, some of them will take an interest in it, and then you start to merge the two. And I've seen that happen with especially Jamify, the music NFT marketplace built on BSV. I've seen that happen where these artists get in and then they start to use other stuff, right? They start to use other stuff on the chain. And it kind of has this snowball effect where it just builds up because these communities that never would have even thought about looking at each other now kind of do. And you're not going to get 100%, but if it's 5% conversion rate, I mean, that's more into it. It's like the Venn diagram, right?
Yeah.
You build up that middle part slowly over time. So, but like I said, that's why I mentioned the humility, because this stuff is not going to be get rich quick, right? It's going to be kind of a grind, but there's a risk, right? You're taking a risk on this new tech that may or may not work. We certainly do think it will work in the future, but it's going to be a grind at first. But I think that's just life.
Yeah, I mean, it's exciting, I agree. Like that's kind of how I've been trying to get everybody to think of it, because it's two markets that we're kind of working with, and I'm honestly like the real world, that's been there, done that. It's BSV world is kind of like this wild territory that could potentially be more profitable, because one of the goals for me, at least as a founder of the label, is to pay every artist that we work with as fairly and as equitably as possible to build up this relationship of like what like the I'm the something I'd like to prove with this project is that we can make money off a small fan base, which I feel like is an idea that is out there on the internet, but like not really. It's all very niche, on like Twitch or Patreon or whatever. It's like people are starting to get this idea, but it's not, really widespread, and certainly not in something like a record label.
Right.
So yeah.
With this, back to my point, which is related, the first person to take these risks are the ones that get the bullet, right? And a lot of people can't take that.
Yeah.
But because if I were to give an analogy, it's probably like the gold rush. If someone came back to the mining town, or to a town, and said, "Hey, I just mined some gold out here in this random place," they'd be like, "Man, get out of here! What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
But then when he brings back some, everyone's like, "Oh." Then they go and they tell their friends, and now then you get the FOMO, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have a smaller artist that made $50 on an NFT sale, if he tells his friends, they're gonna be like, "Oh, I want to do it too. I want to try it too." And then again, it just grows. But that those first few can be disheartening because of the low volume and activity, and especially the negativity that they could be. But I think that's it with any risk taker, right? Any risk taker is gonna be told you're crazy, right? Like when I quit to work on BSV, my folks still don't know what I do, right? And they're like, why'd you leave that job, right? I still get that 3 years later. So
yeah,
there's always a risk with this stuff, but not everyone's got the stomach for it. But if they're willing to tough it out, they can get the benefits that they see in the long term.
Yeah.
Oh, the other point you talked about with the artists and kind of doing new stuff with the payments. As an artist does this over time, if they start to provide these benefits to the fans, there's records of that on chain. So as time gets built and for example, let's say they're buying NFTs and you do some perk where you say whoever bought 5 of the last NFT songs I released get backstage passes. And then the backstage passes are actually issued on chain. And they might be tradable or whatever, but the artist can dictate that. If people can see that and then there's like a skin built to show that's on-chain activity, that's provable, you increase trust with the users and the fan base. And that also strengthens connection because then other people will know, okay, if I actually engage in this, I'm going to be rewarded. Whereas a lot of the problems that we've seen in the crypto space over the last 3 months is where contracts like this were totally violated, right? Where people staked their coins on these different platforms, told they were going to get a percentage. In reality, they stopped getting a percentage and they got their assets seized or stolen, whatever, right? So, and then a lot of this stuff was done off chain, which defeats the whole purpose of the blockchain industry. And that's why you have to have scale because this stuff needs to be very cheap to write these records on chain. And then, the tooling, as you mentioned, needs to be built for this. But you can kind of just see this build incrementally over time, but it just takes someone to recognize it and, be the one that and take the bullet and keep going and build this community out.
Yeah, so I'm starting to feel like, so we're still gonna go ahead and proceed with putting our, first 4 releases on Relay. And we're gonna go ahead full steam and do that and continue to build community and do as much as we can. But I'm really starting to feel like, maybe I gotta be the one to kind of the build like the first version of, what we want out of this to like kind of get the most out of it. Because I think like, I want to move beyond just selling the music file itself, because I don't believe that in today's world that's enough, and I think I gotta end up being the one to kind of take the risk of like building, our storefront and all that sort of thing. So I guess my next question, and I sort of know the answer to this already, but like, there's no book on how to program BSV. I know I actually would be curious, to what degree does BTC resources actually apply to BSV programming? That's something I feel like nobody talks about. Because there's plenty of BTC resources out there. And I know there's a few BSV resources out there, but like, to what degree can you do it? And how would you, like, let's say I'm a junior C++ JavaScript developer. How can I, go from, square one to building a real usable application?
I think some of the existing stuff that's out there are the money button docs. Those are pretty good, at least to get started. Ryan X Charles has a series of where he shows off the library they built for it, and he just goes through the basics of it. I think that's good. I can shell my channel as well. I've done a bunch of JavaScript tutorials on how to do various basic things. But those things don't really teach you the application side. I think merging that with web development is kind of crucial because then you can start, if you can do stuff in JavaScript, then you can easily put that on the web. So W3 Schools, this is what I tell folks every time, is that tutorial website. I personally know people who have used that as the base ground and they went on to make actual applications.
So, yeah, so I'm familiar with W3 and all that. So I guess this is totally for me, but in the MERN stack, right? Like Mongo, database, Express, React, Node, which part of that does Bitcoin take over? Is it the database?
I don't think it does.
It doesn't.
I think people should still be running databases because you're going to have latency, and you also are relying on some node, whether it's a block explorer or a service provider. I mean, if you have a deal with that service provider, sure, you could do that. But this is trade-off, right? And then, frankly, in my view, there's a risk of latency and UX disadvantages for doing that That's
Mm.
why I think caching, at least in some data store. Now, I think it makes you more lean. I do think it makes your database lower size, but I don't think it gets rid of the database. Like for all my apps, most of them I run databases.
Okay.
Um, I do think, this is something I should talk about more, but the web database, IndexedDB, I think Bitcoin is a excellent match for that. Browsers have that for at a domain level, and I think leveraging that is really good for caching.
Mm.
It just makes a lot of sense.
I'm because we're a record label, but we're also, the idea is to approach building a company through, the the lens of an artistic project. And as a result of that, I hope to be able to build all kinds of things on Bitcoin. Tons of ideas. Don't need to get into all of them here, but yeah, I just feel like some type of familiarity with how it all works um, would be, a really great skill for probably any creative to have going forward. I don't know how much of it will be abstracted away, 5 years from now, 10 years from
Mhm.
now. But since we're here in the iron age of BSV, we need to kind of be tuned into that. I mean, are there any other resources you would point to for that sort of thing? Um,
Some of the GitHubs, like the open source ones that different projects have done. I know Tokenize has done a bunch of work on this front, as
hmm,
well as the Run team. They have different GitHubs that are out there where they've built tools for people to use. I did a open source Run token wallet that also manages Bitcoin too. That's out there. It's called Teak Case.
yeah.
So that is a good example of how you can merge it all together.
Hmm.
There's some other ones too. I don't know them off the top of my head, but there's some repos of different GitHubs. I'll try to find and see if that site's still up, but it was registering all the various tools and sites and open source coding things that folks were building on Bitcoin, and also in different languages too. I think the BitcoinSV wiki has a list of that as well.
Hmm.
I don't know if it's maintained or not though, but it should still be there. And
Awesome.
then
Thank you.
I can address your point about the BTC development. The issue with that is they limit their protocol at the core is still the same, but the issue is they've added so much stuff, and that's what people are doing. So anything to do with SegWit, Taproot, pay to script hash, none of that exists. None of that was in the base Bitcoin protocol.
Hmm.
So that stuff should be ignored. Really, the only value would be multi-sig and pay to public key hash, which is just sending to an address.
Hmm.
But I mean, that's so simple that really there's no value add there. So that's the only core. I mean, if you know how to do a transaction on BTC, that's definitely going to help you on BSV. But because you can only do 6 transaction types on BTC,
Yeah.
what's the point, right? I mean, it's just so the older, ironically, the older the documentation and the more lean it is and more base. That learnmeabitcoin.org site is really good. You
Hmm.
just
Oh, which one is it? Say it
It's
again.
called Learn Me a Bitcoin. I think it's .org. Not
Okay.
sure. That site is very good. It goes through the basics, and they have very little on the added stuff, and that can just be ignored.
All the bloat.
Um,
Yeah.
but it's an old site. I mean, you can tell when you go to it, you're like, oh, this is old, but it's really good.
Yeah.
Um, that could be leveraged for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it's just hilarious. I've been looking into a lot of what I've gotten from you about Ethereum being singly threaded, and the only things you can find on the internet that talk about it at all are from like 6, 7 years ago. I mean, it's hilarious.
Yeah, because you can't have the new bag holders that are buying this to know that.
Right, right. Um, okay. One other thing that I wanted to get into was, and this is definitely a little more speculative. We're sitting at the beginning of a hopefully long history with Bitcoin, and at this point, everybody that's thinking about this really seriously, I feel like they're focused on, how to grow the Bitcoin economy, what it needs, all very important topics. I would love to contribute to that conversation, but I'm a simple musician. I'm a craftsman. I'm not a great programming mind. I don't know how to build the Bitcoin economy.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said before, arguably the last thing Bitcoin needs right now is like content. It's another thing. Content about Bitcoin, maybe. But the last thing Bitcoin needs is like art and, things that are already existent in the real world, but now on BSV, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you see as, I guess, so you did already address that what is good about that is that there are people in Bitcoin who are enthusiastic. And I agree. That's actually kind of the main reason why I decided to even try all this, because, as with anything, there's kind of like you're either, you don't want to be too late and you don't want to be too early. And there's kind of like a nice, you want to kind of time it such that you can, I guess, take advantage of people's enthusiasm for such things. But it's still a niche community. It's still tiny. We still have to deal with, tons of social social media war and information war and all that. So what do you think is really the role of like content creators who are not necessarily making content about Bitcoin, but rather using BSV as like a tool? Like, what is that role in this world at the moment when it's like so not needed,
Yeah. I think, yeah, there's a gap, huge gap there. Personally, I've debated whether to do a Patreon. On one hand, I think it's could be value add, but on the other, I kind of don't want to. I feel like it opposes a lot of the stuff because of the nature of that system. I think Patreon's good. I do think Bitcoin in the long run completely deprecates it.
Yeah.
And can replace it. But, so on that end, it's kind of like, out there shilling, say, precious metals or something, but on the back end, it's always selling it, right? Never actually holding any of it. So I think that a light touch might be the way in merging, like we talked about merging the communities. It's kind of like, talking to two different groups of people and marketing differently. So it's a bit of a weird effort on the creator's part.
Yeah.
Um, that's kind of worked out for myself, using some of the native platforms on Bitcoin to do it, but also the standard big tech ones like Twitter and YouTube and Reddit. So it's kind of worked out. So I think, maybe as simple as shilling one on the other, on like shilling the other on the other, right?
Yeah.
So if you're doing YouTube, hand cash wallets linked to your site, that sort of thing. And then if on your site, you link to the other stuff. And then, peppering it in, like talking about it. With that said, for example, on my channel, the least viewed videos are the ones talking about my apps, which is funny. So, it is just kind of is what it is, right? But then there's some people that like that, right? So,
yeah.
And that's those get conversions and customers. So, it's really a weird situation, but I think, it kind of it's just like a small snowball. I think that if it's done, some people will pay attention to it and get interested in it. Um, but I really think just over time, like being consistent with it, and like I said, establishing that reputation and that trust, that will kind of build it up to make it a thing that people outside the space will just naturally become interested in.
Thanks so much, Josh. Really appreciate you coming on, having this conversation. I hope we could do it again and get into like more kind of world of Bitcoin stuff. Cause
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
I don't know about you. I'm sure you do. I don't know. There's nobody around me that knows anything about BSV or crypto at all. So I definitely, you know, there's a lot to talk about for sure.
Okay, cool. Yep. Thanks for having me. Enjoying the conversation.
Thanks, man.